It was an ordinary autumn evening in a small, quiet town nestled in the hills. The sun had already set, casting a cold shadow over the neighborhood. In an old house at the edge of town lived George and Martha, a couple in their late 70s. Their home was modest, but filled with memories. Decades of photographs, furniture worn from years of use, and the smell of old wood that spoke of years of love and laughter. They had lived there for over 50 years, raising children and growing old together. Martha sat in her favorite armchair by the fireplace, knitting a sweater she had promised to finish before winter. George, on the other hand, was in the kitchen, tinkering with an old radio he'd been trying to fix for months. The air was thick with the crackle of static as the radio hummed a song from a bygone era. They both enjoyed the peaceful routine of their lives, the silence only broken by the occasional creak of the house or the distant chirping of crickets outside. But that night, something felt off. It began with a soft thud, the kind of noise you dismiss as nothing at first, but it came again. A faint thump, as though something heavy was being dragged across the floor upstairs. George frowned and wiped his hands on his apron. "Did you hear that, Martha?" he called out from the kitchen. Martha glanced up from her knitting, a frown creasing her forehead. "I thought it was just the wind. Maybe the house settling," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. Another thud echoed through the house, louder this time, followed by a dragging sound, like something or someone moving across the floor upstairs. "That doesn't sound like the wind," George muttered, his face pale. He set down the radio and walked cautiously toward the staircase. "Martha, stay here," he said, his voice trembling. But Martha, sensing the unease in his voice, stood up from her chair. "I'll come with you," she said, her hand clutching her shawl. Together they climbed the creaky stairs to the second floor. The house was silent again, but the oppressive stillness made it feel even more unnerving. The hallway was dimly lit by the weak glow of a single light bulb hanging from the ceiling. As they approached the bedroom at the end of the hall, they both stopped in their tracks. The door was ajar, and beyond it, the room was dark. The bed, however, was unsettlingly disheveled. The sheets were torn, as if something had been thrashing around in the night. The closet door was wide open, the contents of Martha's old wardrobe scattered across the floor. "Who could have?" George began, but his voice trailed off, swallowed by the thick air in the room. Suddenly the phone rang, piercing the silence like a gunshot. Both of them jumped, and for a moment, neither moved. The phone, an old rotary style, sat on the small wooden table beside the bed. It rang again, and George quickly crossed the room to answer it. "Hello?" he said, his voice shaky. There was silence on the other end, then a faint, rasping breath. "George," a voice whispered, low and distant. "George, we're here." Martha's blood ran cold. She stumbled backward, gripping the doorframe for support. "Who is it, George?" she asked, her voice barely audible. The voice on the other end of the line seemed to strain against some unseen force. It was familiar, but wrong, like it was speaking through a filter of static. "George, it's us," the voice repeated. "We're coming. Upstairs." George's heart skipped a beat. The voice was unmistakable. It sounded like his late brother, Henry, who had died in a car accident years ago. His hand shook as he held the phone, but he couldn't find the words to respond. His throat tightened, and for a brief moment, he thought he heard footsteps, soft but deliberate, coming from the floor above. Suddenly, the door to the room slammed shut, causing both of them to jump. The wind howled outside, and the room grew colder. George rushed to open the door, but the knob wouldn't turn. He twisted it with all his might, but it remained locked. Panicking, he shouted for Martha to help, but when she turned to him, her face was blank, her eyes wide and unfocused. "Martha!" George called, his voice rising in fear. But she didn't respond. Instead, she turned slowly, her face contorting into something unnatural. It was as if the life in her eyes had drained away, leaving behind only emptiness. Her lips parted, and she began to speak in a voice that wasn't hers. "George, we've been waiting. It's time," the voice said, low and guttural, as if from deep within her throat. George recoiled, his chest tightening in terror. "What are you saying? What do you mean?" The phone call continued in the background, now frantic. "George, she's one of us now. We've waited too long. You have to join us." Desperately, George grabbed the phone again, but this time, when he tried to speak, a screeching static drowned out his words. The voice on the line began to laugh, an eerie, hollow sound that echoed through the walls of the old house. And then, without warning, the call abruptly ended. The silence that followed was deafening. Martha stood motionless, staring at him with those empty eyes. Slowly, she took a step toward him, and then another, her feet dragging across the floor. The air grew colder with each passing second, and George felt as though he were suffocating. "No, no, no," he whispered, backing away from her. But it was no use. He could feel a presence now, like cold fingers brushing his spine. He reached for the door again, his heart pounding, but the door wouldn't budge. His mind raced. Something was terribly wrong. Martha wasn't Martha anymore. Suddenly, a muffled voice echoed from the other side of the door. "George, help me," it whispered, familiar and soft. His blood ran cold. He knew that voice. It was Martha's, but it wasn't coming from the door. Behind him, Martha, or whatever she had become, reached out, her hand cold as ice. As her fingers brushed his shoulder, he screamed. The lights flickered, and the house seemed to groan with age, the walls trembling as though something ancient and unseen was clawing to get out. And then, in the flash of a single heartbeat, the phone rang again. This time, George didn't dare answer it. The next morning, when the authorities arrived, they found the house in complete disarray. George and Martha were nowhere to be found, and the house was locked from the inside. The phone, however, sat on the table, still off the hook, its line dead. No one ever found out what happened to the old couple, but the strange thing was, every so often, a 911 call would come through in the middle of the night. The dispatcher would pick up the line, but all they would hear was soft breathing and then the faint sound of a voice whispering, "We're still here. We're waiting." The house was eventually abandoned, its walls sagging with age, but no one dared move in. And if you listen closely on quiet nights, you can still hear the whispers on the wind. Months passed since George and Martha vanished without a trace, and the town slowly tried to forget the strange events that had transpired. The house, still standing at the edge of town, became a symbol of mystery and unease. It was abandoned, its windows dark, its door permanently locked. Yet there was always something unsettling about the place. The townspeople would say it was just the house settling, nothing more. But the feeling of dread that clung to it was palpable. One evening, a young couple, newly married and eager to begin a new life away from the hustle of the city, drove through the sleepy town. They had heard the stories, of course, but they saw only an old house in need of repair, a fixer-upper with potential. "I bet we could make it beautiful again," Sarah said as they passed by. Her eyes gleamed with excitement at the thought of a new project. Her husband, Brian, was a bit more skeptical but smiled in agreement. They both loved old houses, the charm of their history. But something about this one, with its sagging roof and overgrown garden, caught Brian's attention in a way he couldn't quite explain. "There's something off about it," he muttered, though he didn't voice his feelings out loud. He figured it was just a gut reaction to the eerie stories circulating the town, things that were probably just rumors. But Sarah was determined. She convinced Brian to stop and take a closer look. Together they parked in front of the house and stood on the overgrown lawn, surrounded by the neglected garden. The house, though weathered, had a certain grandeur to it. The tall windows, though cracked, still let in the fading light of the setting sun. It was as if the house was waiting for someone to breathe life into it again. "Let's look inside," Sarah said, her voice filled with excitement. Brian hesitated. "I don't know. I mean, it's been abandoned for a long time. You said you wanted to do something adventurous, right? What better way to start than by bringing this house back to life?" Brian shrugged, a nervous laugh escaping him. "I guess you're right." But as they made their way toward the front door, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into something they couldn't control. The door creaked open with a single push. Inside, the air was stale, thick with dust and the scent of old wood. They stepped inside, the floorboards groaning beneath their feet. Sarah immediately went toward the grand staircase, her hand trailing along the banister. Brian lingered by the door, feeling the weight of the silence in the house. His eyes wandered over to the phone, sitting on a small table beside the front hall. It was old, rotary, like something you'd see in an antique shop. He stepped closer to it, and for reasons he couldn't explain, he reached down and picked it up. Suddenly, a loud thud echoed from upstairs, followed by a dragging noise. Brian froze, his heart racing. The sound was unmistakable. It was the same noise George and Martha had heard all those months ago. He quickly set the phone back down and glanced toward Sarah, who was still admiring the staircase, unaware of the sound. "Did you hear that?" Brian asked, his voice trembling. "Hear what?" Sarah turned around, smiling. But when she saw his face, the smile faded. "The noise, like something's moving upstairs." For a moment, there was no response. Then the dragging sound came again, closer this time. Slowly, hesitantly, Sarah and Brian made their way toward the staircase. The air grew colder as they ascended, their footsteps sounding too loud in the oppressive silence. They reached the second floor and found the hallway dimly lit by the weak light from a single bulb hanging overhead. The door to the master bedroom was ajar, and the dragging sound was now unmistakably coming from inside. "Should we check it out?" Sarah asked, her voice quivering. Brian swallowed hard. "We don't know what could be in there. It might just be an animal." But deep down, both of them knew that wasn't the case. Whatever was making the noise was not natural. It was deliberate, methodical. With a deep breath, Brian pushed the door open. The room was a mess, clothes strewn about, the bed half turned over, and the closet door hanging wide open. But there was something else, something more disturbing. The floorboards in the corner were freshly disturbed, as if someone had been digging beneath them. And on the floor, in the middle of the room, was the faint outline of something or someone. "Sarah, look," Brian whispered, his voice barely audible. There, in the corner of the room, were two shapes, pale, emaciated figures, crouched together in a grotesque imitation of human form. They were staring at the floor, their faces covered by their hair, their bodies unnaturally still. The dragging sound was now clear. One of them was dragging itself along the floor, its hands gripping the ground in desperate, jerky movements. Sarah gasped, her breath catching in her throat. Before Brian could react, the phone rang. It was a sharp, jarring sound, and it felt like it was echoing through their bones. Brian turned toward it, his heart pounding in his chest. The phone was off the hook again, the line dead. But when he reached for it, the noise stopped, and then the whispering began. "Brian," came a voice, soft, hoarse, and hollow. It was as if it had been carried through the wires, through the very walls of the house. "We're still here." Brian's blood ran cold. He looked at Sarah, who was now trembling in fear. "Who is it?" he asked, his voice cracking. The voice on the other end sounded almost familiar, but wrong, like a distorted echo. "Come closer, Brian. We've been waiting." Before Brian could respond, the dragging sound came again, louder this time, and the figures in the corner began to move. Slowly, they turned toward him, their faces still hidden by their unkempt hair. But as they rose to their feet, he could see their eyes. Empty, hollow, dark, and they were coming toward him. "Get out! Now!" Brian shouted, grabbing Sarah's hand and pulling her toward the door. But as they reached the hallway, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang, trapping them inside. The temperature dropped. Their breath fogged in the air as the whispers grew louder. "Stay with us," the voices called. "Stay with us forever." Desperately, Brian tried to break down the door, his fists pounding against the wood. But the room was growing darker, the shadows creeping along the walls like living things. The whispers were no longer coming from the phone. They were all around them, surrounding them. They could feel something closing in, something ancient, something hungry. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the house fell silent. When the authorities arrived the next morning, they found the house locked, just like before. But this time, when they searched the upstairs room, there was no sign of Brian and Sarah. The floor was undisturbed, the door to the room wide open. The house was empty. The only thing they found was the old phone, lying on the floor beside the table, the line dead, and the faint whisper of a voice carrying on the wind. "We're still here. We've been waiting." As for Brian and Sarah, they were never found. The house remained abandoned, untouched by human hands. But sometimes, when the wind howls through the trees, people say they can hear the whispers from inside. And the phone, still sitting in its place, rings once more.